The night of March 29, 2008, began like any ordinary Saturday in São Paulo, the kind people barely remember a week later. The city was preparing to slow down, the apartments dimming one window at a time, as families wrapped up their day. In a condominium in the Jardim Trianon neighborhood, nothing seemed out of place. Alexandre Nardoni and his wife, Ana Carolina Jatoba, were at home with their children, and 5-year-old Isabela had been brought over by her father to spend the weekend, something that was supposed to be simple, predictable, peaceful. But the shadows of that night would stretch far beyond the building's facade, carrying a story that would disturb an entire country. Inside the apartment, the routine seemed intact. The television buzzed in the background, toys lay scattered in silent corners, and the couple's other children were already drifting towards sleep. Alexandre said he had carried Isabela upstairs, laid her gently on the bed, and left her resting while he went back down to bring up the baby stroller and the bags. Everything appeared normal, structured, nothing hinting at the horror that was about to unfold. Yet behind the closed door of that apartment, a tragic sequence of events had already begun, one that no neighbor, friend, or relative could have predicted. At approximately 11:30 p.m., the tranquility shattered with a scream that ripped through the courtyard. A resident from inside the building dialed 190 in utter panic, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what she had just seen. "They threw a child from upstairs," she cried, barely able to articulate her shock. Her words collided with the background noise of people shouting, running, frantically trying to understand what had happened. The dispatcher, trained to remain calm, heard the despair and urgency in her voice. She repeated the address, Rua Santa Leocadia, 138, while the caller sobbed uncontrollably. Moments later, neighbors rushed outside, gathering around the small, fragile body lying in the internal garden of the building. The little girl was still breathing, barely, her body broken by the fall from the 6th floor. Her pajamas were torn, her hair matted, her limbs unnaturally twisted, and yet the most haunting detail was the soft rise and fall of her chest, proof that she was still alive in those final seconds. People screamed her name, others searched for help, and the building descended into chaos. Nobody could comprehend how a child who had arrived smiling and unharmed hours earlier had ended up dying on the cold ground. When the police arrived, they found Alexandre in a state that oscillated between shock and justification. He insisted that he had left Isabela sleeping, and that, in the moments he was away from the apartment, someone must have broken in, cut the protective window screen, and thrown her out. He clung to this version with conviction, presenting himself as a father blindsided by unimaginable violence. The officers listened but sensed something was off. His words came too quickly, too pre-packaged, as if he needed them to be true more than he believed they actually were. The ambulance attempted to save Isabela, but her injuries were too severe. The fall had caused irreversible trauma. She was pronounced dead shortly after. The sirens faded, the courtyard emptied, and the police remained alone with the questions that no one could yet answer. How had a little girl ended up on the ground of a supposedly safe building? Why were there no signs of forced entry? And why did the version given by the father feel like the start of a story that didn't match the reality around them? This was the first moment investigators realized. What seemed at first like an accident was, in truth, the opening chapter of a tragedy far darker than anyone was prepared for. The chaos following the emergency call spread quickly through the condominium. Residents emerged from their apartments in disbelief, some still in pajamas, others clutching their phones, all drawn by the haunting sound of the caller's voice echoing through the courtyard. The scene was surreal. Bright security lights cast long shadows on the ground where Isabela lay motionless, while neighbors circled in a mixture of terror and helplessness. It didn't feel like reality. It felt like a collective nightmare unfolding in real time. And yet the details were painfully real. The torn screen above, the body below, and the shattering silence between sobs. As officers began gathering the first impressions, they found Alexandra and Ana Carolina presenting a facade of shock. But beneath the trembling voices and frantic gestures, something felt rehearsed. Alexandra repeated the same explanation to everyone. He had left Isabela asleep, gone downstairs, and returned to find confusion. He insisted a stranger must have slipped into the apartment, cut the screen, and thrown the child out. His eyes were wide, but the timing of his words, the urgency to narrate before questions were even asked, created a silent discomfort among the officers. Inside the apartment, the environment contradicted the story. The door was locked, untouched. The living room was undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no footprints, no displaced objects that would indicate the presence of an invader. The apartment felt strangely calm, almost sterile, as if nothing violent had just occurred. Officers looked at one another, quietly acknowledging that the scene did not align with the father's claims. It was as though the story had been placed on top of the reality like a thin, transparent film, visible but unconvincing. The officers noted the timeline. The engine of Alexandre's car shut off at 23:36, and by 23:49, the ambulance was already on the scene. 13 minutes. 13 minutes for a stranger to supposedly break in, cut the screen, attack a child, and escape unnoticed from a monitored building. It was impossible. Condominiums with controlled access do not simply allow shadowy figures to slip in and out. No alarms were triggered. No cameras recorded unusual movement, and no neighbor reported anything out of the ordinary besides the final fall. Time was working against Alexandre's narrative. As the firefighters carried Isabela's small body away, detectives began focusing on the screen itself, the element Alexandre relied on to justify the presence of a stranger. But the closer they examined it, the stranger it looked. The cut was too clean, too precise, and too conveniently positioned. It wasn't torn. It was sliced, and the fibers pointed in one unmistakable direction. The cut had been made from the inside, not the outside. Officers exchanged glances, and in that moment, the story of the mysterious intruder began to crumble like the fragile edge of the broken mesh. Still, they needed proof, not suspicions, so they documented every detail: the angle of the cut, the placement of the screen remnants, the height of the bed, the distance to the window. The courtyard remained sealed as a crime scene. Residents were questioned, and officers began outlining hypotheses. But internally, the shift had already happened. What initially sounded like a desperate tragedy was evolving into something far more disturbing. And as the night deepened, the investigators realized they were standing at the edge of a story that would grip the entire nation. At dawn, forensic experts entered the apartment to conduct the first precise examination of the environment. They walked slowly, documenting each surface, each stain, each misplaced fiber. While the interior appeared visually intact, small inconsistencies began to emerge, subtle yet unmistakable to trained eyes. The furniture had no signs of disturbance. The floors had no drag marks, and yet small specks, faint smears, fragile traces began to reveal a story no one had spoken aloud. The apartment wasn't a stage for a break-in. It was a container of hidden violence. The first shocking discovery came from the living room. On the floor near the sofa, forensic specialists identified faint spots that reacted to luminol, blood traces invisible to the naked eye. They belonged to Isabela. The revelation struck investigators hard. The child had been injured before reaching the window. If this were truly an accident, why was there blood inside the apartment? Why did it appear on surfaces she should not have touched if she had simply fallen? In the couple's bedroom, more signs appeared. The bedsheets were wrinkled in a way that suggested hurried movement, not rest. A small drop of blood was found near the entrance to the hallway. The bathroom revealed faint streaks on the sink, consistent with someone washing hands or attempting to clean evidence. These details deepened the suspicion that violence preceded the fall, and whoever was inside the apartment attempted to erase the traces before calling for help. The apartment remained silent, but every surface whispered the same truth. Something terrible had happened behind these walls. Forensic experts then examined Alexandre's car. Inside, they found blood traces matching Isabela's profile, blood that should not have been there if she had only been carried sleeping from the vehicle to the apartment. This single discovery shattered the timeline and contradicted Alexandre's entire account. It meant the child was already hurt before even entering the home. And if she was hurt earlier, who could have harmed her except the two adults who had custody of her at that moment? As they pieced together the fragments, investigators began to see the chain of events. Isabela had been injured inside the car, carried upstairs already bleeding, and then further assaulted inside the apartment. The fall was not the cause of the initial harm, it was the final act. And the people who were supposed to protect her had instead tried to rewrite the narrative in real time. The mystery intruder vanished completely from the realm of possibility. By the time forensic teams completed their initial analysis, the apartment's facade of normality had collapsed. The truth was forming, cold and heavy, like a storm cloud ready to burst. The crime had not been spontaneous, and it had not been committed by an outsider. It had roots, emotional, personal, intimate, and the signs of that violence were etched into every corner of the home. The evidence regarding the protective screen became the turning point that forced investigators to fully abandon the possibility of an intruder. The screen's fibers were spread inside the apartment, not outside, meaning the cut came from someone within the room. The angle of the cut was also precise, consistent with a downward slicing motion performed from inside, not with the tearing or pulling that would occur if someone tried to break in from the outside. This finding cast a spotlight directly on the last people inside that apartment, Alexandre and Anna Carolina. When investigators questioned the couple again, their answers began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. Alexandre repeated his version about leaving Isabela sleeping, but his narrative lacked coherence when matched against the timeline and forensic finding. Anna Carolina's statements were equally inconsistent, shifting subtly as new details emerged. Their reactions were scrutinized not for emotion, but for consistency, and consistency was something neither could offer. The reconstruction of the crime revealed the physical impossibility of the intruder hypothesis. The window was positioned in a way that made external access nearly impossible without leaving marks. The walls showed no scratches, no footprints, no handprints, no signs of climbing or support, and the cut screen, lying neatly inside the room, felt almost staged, as though someone had created an element of chaos to support a collapsing version of events. Meanwhile, Isabela's injuries told a story that contradicted the fall narrative entirely. She had suffered asphyxiation marks, finger-shaped bruises around her throat, long before the fall. Her wrists showed signs of restraint, and her head injuries had been inflicted while she was still alive. These signs were impossible to ignore. A child who falls accidentally does not present signs of strangulation. Someone had gripped her neck. Someone had suffocated her. Someone inside that apartment had used force on her before throwing her from the window. This discovery ignited a wave of outrage among investigators. The violence inflicted on Isabela was not the result of panic or accident. It was deliberate. The screen cutting, the fabricated story, the blood traces, everything pointed toward manipulation. The investigators felt the weight of what they were uncovering. This was no ordinary homicide. It was a brutal assault followed by a desperate attempt to disguise the truth. By this stage of the investigation, the police no longer sought an unknown suspect. They sought motive. They began to examine the family dynamics, the tensions between Anna Carolina and Isabela's biological mother, the jealousy, the conflicts, the history of arguments. The case was no longer about what happened. It was about why it happened and who was responsible for each step. As forensic specialists expanded their analysis, they focused on the contradictions hidden in the apartment's physical structure. While Alexandra insisted that a stranger had entered the home, investigators found no damage to the lock, no unusual fingerprints, and no traces of forced entry on doors or windows. Everything was intact, calm, almost untouched. Yet within this perfect stillness, they found something undeniably telling: the clean, deliberate cut in the protective screen. The cut was not jagged or frantic. It was controlled, performed with a tool, not with force, and the pattern of the sliced mesh revealed the truth that transformed the investigation. The cut originated from inside the apartment, not from outside. This single detail was enough to destroy the intruder theory. A stranger breaking into an apartment would leave signs, scratches, dents, fibers pulled outward, disrupted items around the entry point. But the cut screen looked as if it had been manipulated to create a narrative rather than to commit a crime. The placement of the screen remnants inside the room suggested someone had cut it deliberately and allowed the pieces to scatter on the floor as evidence, unaware that forensic science could determine the direction of the incision. It was not a trace left by an attacker. It was a trace left by a storyteller. At the same time, in other corners of the apartment, investigators detected small but crucial details that contradicted any possibility of an accidental fall. Blood droplets belonging to Isabela were found on the floor and on the door frame, faint but unmistakable under luminol. The pattern of the stains suggested movement, suggested that she had been carried while injured, No accidental fall could place blood inside the vehicle, inside the hallway, and inside the apartment all at once. Every stain spoke quietly, but firmly that Isabela had been harmed before she went near the window. The more investigators analyzed, the clearer the timeline became. Isabela had been injured in the car, carried upstairs while already bleeding, taken inside the apartment, assaulted again, and then thrown from the window. The fall was not the main event, it was the cover. The attempt to disguise an internal assault as an external invasion showed a level of premeditation that investigators could not ignore. The story woven by Alexandra and Anna Carolina was no longer fragile, it was shattered. When specialists examined what would have been Isabela's final moments inside the apartment, they found overwhelming evidence that aligned perfectly with physical violence. The marks around her neck were consistent with asphyxiation, not with the natural compression of a fall. The injuries to her head were consistent with blunt force trauma delivered while she was still alive, and her ribs exhibited signs of pressure, suggesting someone had held her down. None of these findings matched the narrative of a fall without intervention. They matched instead the actions of someone attempting to silence a child. The weight of these findings altered the direction of the case permanently. What initially seemed like a mysterious accident had transformed into a tragic, intimate betrayal. The apartment that should have been a sanctuary became the setting of a crime committed behind closed doors, and forensic science, piece by piece, stripped away the layers of falsehoods until only the truth remained. Isabela's death was not an accident, not a mistake, not an act of a stranger. It was an act from within. As investigators continued to retrace the movements of that night, the sequence of events inside the apartment became clearer and darker. They now understood that Isabela had not simply wandered toward the window. She had been assaulted. Evidence showed she was struck, suffocated, and left temporarily unconscious. These findings contradicted not only Alexandra's initial claims, but every variation of his statements afterward. The logic was indisputable. A child cannot be suffocated and struck unconsciously and then fall accidentally. Someone had taken deliberate action, with intent and force. The reconstruction of the crime inside the apartment revealed a chilling silence. Experts walked through the rooms step by step, mimicking the possible sequence of violence. They discovered that the hallway carried faint traces of blood, forming a path that suggested the child was dragged or carried from one room to another. The bathroom sink bore signs of recent cleaning attempts, its drain containing microscopic traces of Isabela's blood. These were not the actions of someone reacting in desperation. They were the actions of someone trying to erase what had already been done. Attention then turned to the window. The inspectors measured the distance from the bed to the sill, the angle at which the screen had been cut, and the height of the ledge. They concluded that Isabela could not have climbed or reached the window on her own with the force required to break through a protective net. She was too small, too light, too injured. Someone had carried her there. Someone had lifted her. Someone had thrown her from the 6th floor in an attempt to conceal the earlier abuse. This discovery was more than forensic evidence. It was moral devastation. Meanwhile, further analysis on Isabela's body revealed the horrifying truth of her final moments. Her lungs, her bones, the bruises on her arms and face all testified to violence before the fall. She had been alive when she was thrown, but not conscious. The combination of esganadura, manual strangulation, and blunt force trauma left her in a vulnerable state before she was launched into the air. The fall was what ultimately killed her, but it was not the beginning of the attack. It was the ending of it. Investigators also found defensive wounds on her hands, tiny marks that indicated she had tried, in her last moments of awareness, to protect herself from someone stronger. These small, heartbreaking details became central to the emotional and criminal understanding of the case. They revealed a child who had fought for her life, and the overwhelming disparity of strength between her and her attackers. The investigation no longer saw Isabela as a passive victim of chance, but as a child caught in a violent struggle inside her own home. By the end of this phase, authorities were certain of only one thing. Isabela did not die because she fell. She died because she was assaulted, suffocated, and then thrown. The fall was not the cause, it was the disguise, and the people responsible for that disguise were the same people responsible for the violence. With the forensic evidence accumulating, investigators began piecing together the psychological dimension of the crime. they turned their attention to the relationship dynamics inside the household, specifically between Anna Carolina Jatoba and Isabela. Reports from relatives and witnesses painted a picture of escalating tension. Neighbors mentioned frequent arguments, and acquaintances recalled moments when Anna Carolina's irritation with the child would surface abruptly. This tension was not isolated. It was woven into the fabric of the family's daily life. Testimonies highlighted a deeper issue. Anna Carolina harbored strong jealousy toward Alexandre's ex-wife, and by extension, toward Isabela. These emotions simmered silently, and sometimes not so silently, creating an environment of hostility that placed the child at the center of unresolved adult conflicts. Small incidents, seemingly insignificant at first, now became critical pieces of understanding the emotional landscape inside the apartment on the night of the crime. The hostility that once seemed like petty family conflict was now seen as a potential trigger for violence. Investigators soon realized this wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It matched behavioral patterns of escalating aggression, where caretakers overwhelmed by resentment lose control. The timing of Isabela's visit, the stress factors in the household, and the history of conflict converged into a dangerous environment for a vulnerable child. What might have begun as harsh words or frustration had spiraled into something catastrophic. As forensic evidence pointed toward suffocation and physical assault, investigators considered how emotional tension could have escalated into physical violence. They theorized that an argument or confrontation might have erupted shortly after Isabela arrived at the apartment. Anna Carolina, overwhelmed by jealousy or frustration, could have directed her anger toward the child. Alexandre's involvement then became critical. Whether out of fear, shock, or complicity, he did not intervene. Instead, he became part of the aftermath, attempting to cover up the crime rather than protect his daughter. This emotional and psychological analysis strengthened the homicide hypothesis, adding a layer of motive to the physical evidence. It was no longer only about what happened, but why it could have happened. The relationship dynamics aligned with the injuries, the cleanup attempts, and the staged window cut. Motive, means, and opportunity were now firmly established inside the apartment. By the end of this phase, investigators saw the case in full clarity. It was not just a crime of opportunity, it was a crime born from emotional volatility, adult conflicts, and unchecked aggression. The tragedy of Isabela's death was rooted not only in violence, but in a failure of responsibility, empathy, and protection. After months of detailed work, the police prepared the formal indictment. They accused Isabela Nardoni and Anna Carolina Jatoba of homicide triplemente qualificado, three types of aggravating elements that paint the crime as particularly cruel. The first was motivo torpe, rooted in jealousy, anger, and personal conflict. The second was meo cruel, due to the asphyxiation and blows that left Isabela unconscious before the fall. The third was impossibility of defense, given that Isabela, only 5 years old, was attacked without warning and without any chance to fight back. The severity of the charges reflected the deep betrayal of trust inherent in the crime. The law recognizes that children rely entirely on adults for their safety. When adults turn against them, the result is not only a crime, it is a violation of a fundamental duty. Prosecutors emphasized that Alexandre and Anna Carolina were Isabela's guardians that night. Their role was to protect her, not harm her. Instead, they used their position of trust to control, assault, and ultimately kill her. The indictment also included an additional charge for Alexandre: fraudulent alteration of the crime scene. His involvement in the staged cut of the window screen, the manipulation of evidence, and attempts to create the illusion of an intruder positioned him as an active participant not only in the death itself, but in the cover-up. This detail proved he was not a passive witness to violence, but a collaborator in concealing what had happened. The request for their preventive detention was granted immediately. The judge cited the brutality of the crime, the attempted cover-up, the strong forensic evidence, and the need to maintain public order, as the case had already stirred national outrage. The moment the warrant was issued, Alexandra and Anna Carolina transitioned from suspects to officially accused criminals, facing years, decades, behind bars. Media coverage intensified. The public watched every development closely, horrified by the idea that parents could be responsible for such an act. The emotional weight of the case transcended courtroom walls, sparking debates about child safety, domestic violence, and the responsibilities of guardian. It was a crime that struck at the core of societal value. By the time the indictment was finalized, investigators felt a grim sense of closure. They had uncovered the truth piece by piece, and now placed it firmly in the hands of the justice system. But the emotional cost of the case remained, echoing in every corner of the investigation. A child had been killed not by strangers, not by chance, but by the very people meant to protect her. 2 years after the crime, the courtroom at the Forum de Santana filled with journalists, spectators, and legal teams for one of the most anticipated trials in Brazilian history. The atmosphere was electric, heavy with tension and expectation. Outside, crowds gathered behind barricades, holding signs, shouting, praying, demanding justice for a child whose story had pierced the conscience of an entire nation. Inside, the jurors took their seats, prepared to listen to hours, days, of testimony and argumentation. The prosecution opened by painting a detailed narrative of the night, the timeline, the injuries, the staged crime scene, and the psychological motive. They presented the forensic reports with meticulous care, explaining each wound, each trace of blood, each inconsistency in the couple's version. Expert witnesses took the stand, describing the precision of the cut screen, the impossibility of an external intruder, and the unmistakable signs of suffocation before the fall. The jury listened in silence, their faces tightening as each detail unfolded. The defense countered with arguments of accident and doubt, suggesting that the forensic evidence might be misinterpreted. They attempted to reintroduce the intruder theory, argued emotional fragility, and accused investigators of bias. But every theory they presented collided with the facts. Facts rooted in science, in blood, in the physical reality of the apartment. Their strategy became a struggle against overwhelming evidence. Over 5 grueling days, more than 60 hours of session, each side pushed its version with intensity. But the decisive turning point came from the technical proofs, the objective, undeniable forensic elements that transcended emotion or narrative. The jurors understood that there were no eyewitnesses, no confession, no dramatic revelation. What they had was something stronger: science. When the verdict was finally read in the early hours of March 27, 2010, the courtroom vibrated with emotion. Alexandre was sentenced to 31 years, 1 month, and 10 days. Ana Carolina received 26 years and 8 months. The crowd outside erupted, some in relief, others in anger, but all in recognition of the gravity of the moment. The justice system had spoken. The defense appealed, claiming flaws in the investigation and excessive sentencing, but higher courts upheld the decision, reinforcing that the evidence was solid and the verdict just. The trial became a landmark case in Brazilian legal history, not just for its verdict, but for the way it demonstrated the power of forensic science in uncovering the truth. In the years following the crime, the impact of Isabela's death reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The tragedy triggered nationwide discussions about child safety, domestic violence, and the responsibility of adults inside the home. It exposed how violence against children often occurs in silence, hidden behind seemingly stable family structures. The case became a symbol, a painful reminder that danger can exist where trust should reside. The public's reaction evolved from shock to introspection. Teachers, neighbors, extended relatives, and friends began to reflect on their roles as protectors. How many unexplained bruises go unnoticed? How many cries are dismissed as tantrums? How many subtle signs of fear remain unspoken? Isabela's story forced the country to confront these questions with urgency. Over time, her case helped fuel legislative changes aimed at strengthening child protection laws. One of the most significant developments was the creation of the Henry Borel Law in 2022, establishing specific mechanisms to address domestic violence against children and adolescents. It also created a new homicide qualifier for victims under 14, ensuring harsher penalties and classifying such crimes as heinous. Though the law came years after Isabela's death, her case was frequently cited as a catalyst for the movement toward stricter protections. The tragedy also reshaped public perception of shared custody, visitation rights, and the need for better monitoring of family conflicts. Psychologists and social workers emphasize the importance of recognizing tension in blended families, where jealousy, resentment, and unresolved conflicts can create dangerous environments for children. The case underscored the need for vigilance, not only from the state but from society as a whole. Today, Isabela's name continues to evoke a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Her story is retold not to reopen wounds, but to strengthen awareness and prevent future tragedies. She represents the countless children whose voices are too soft to be heard, and whose pain goes unseen. Her memory fuels the commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, the lesson her case leaves behind is stark but necessary. The most vulnerable must be shielded. The warning signs must be acknowledged, and silence must never be an option. Justice, in her name, must remain vigilant. And her story, though heartbreaking, remains a call to action that echoes long after the courtroom lights have dimmed.